Ed here with the Digital Digest, and today I wanted to share a comparison between the Sony CyberShot RX10 Mark IV on the left, priced at $1,700 US, with the Mark III on the right, which is roughly $1,300 US. Now that is a significant price difference between these two cameras, which at face value appear to be identical, but I assure you they are not. And today's video is squarely aimed at helping those of you determine whether or not you should go with the Mark III for less money, the older model, its predecessor, or the brand new launched Mark IV on the left, which again, a significant premium, but for what I perceive to be significant advantages in a bridge-style fixed-lens telephoto beast, which both of these cameras are. So let's start off with form factor. Nothing really has changed. You're looking at two bodies that are virtually identical. Same button layout, same LCD readout on the top right-hand side, same dials for going through the different modes, whether you want to stay in auto, go manual, use Sony scene selections, use the high frame rate mode, the shutter button on both exactly the same, the zoom rocker exactly the same, and all of your access to ports, your I/O, so to speak, also exactly the same. If I go ahead and turn these, you will see immediately we've got, microphone, headphone, HDMI, and micro USB, aka Sony's multi-port on the left side of the body. Guess what? Same thing here on the previous generation. So no change there. In fact, really, when you look at these cameras, again, they look a lot alike. They both have a 20.1 megapixel 1-inch sensor. The key difference here is really performance, and that's what I'm going to be focusing on through the course of this video. This is not going to be a 30-minute comparison because, quite frankly, it just doesn't require 30 minutes to go over the key differences between these two models. So we've gotten price out of the way. Build, you've got weather sealing on both of these. They are not weatherproof, so I do not recommend shooting in extreme conditions with these. It basically equates to if they get wet, they won't die. I still would not recommend getting them wet. Let's leave it at that. Let's focus, though, on what's different. I've mentioned the 20 megapixel sensor. They both have a stacked internal design for that sensor, which equates to the ability to shoot rapid bursts, as well as the high frame rate video mode up to 960 frames per second. The RX10 Mark III comes in at 14 still images per second, whereas the RX10 Mark IV has the bragging right of being able to shoot up to 24 shots. That's 10 more images in a second. So already on a still image basis, you can see how the RX10 Mark IV outshines its predecessor. Again, whether or not that's going to equate to being a palatable price jump is really a matter of the sort of photographic or digital imaging tool that you're out to purchase. Same flash, same button, same build. Again, it's all about the internals. The lens, exactly the same. We're working here with a Carl Zeiss piece of glass, 24 to 600 millimeters in reach, which is really quite a feat for Sony to have accomplished. I remember when the Mark X lineup was all about, constant aperture and a mere 200 millimeters of reach, but now you really cover basically your entire range that you could possibly want to photograph or video for that matter. Both cameras do have that physical switch to allow you to turn the aperture ring right here from a clickable mode to a silent mode. Again, that's going to depend on whether or not you're shooting video or stills. But the most important element in terms of key difference, beyond even just the speed that I just mentioned of your drive mode, 14 versus 24 on the still side, is the actual autofocus system itself. And this is where, in my opinion, without any question whatsoever, the RX10 Mark IV gets the nod from me. Granted, I haven't spent, a month with the camera. I did have a good solid weekend of shooting with it, and it's been a pleasure. Now, that's not to say the Mark III was not also a pleasure. It was best in breed, best of kind, nothing really else like it. and the Mark IV only improves on it because it brought to the table what the Mark III was missing. The Mark IV has phase detection autofocus points, a total of 315. So that means when you shoot with the RX10 Mark IV, you're getting an interchangeable lens camera style of feel in terms of autofocus performance that simply didn't exist on any previous version of the RX10. And that, to me, even if the RX10 Mark IV still was capped out at 14 stills in terms of its highest speed drive mode, I would still be picking the Mark IV because inherently the 315 points of phase detection that it offers that just doesn't exist on the RX10 Mark III or any other RX10 is the difference maker here, folks. It's going to give you the ability to get autofocus results that mirror, not to be cute, something like the A6500, which is an interchangeable lens camera. Close in price point, something I will be comparing to the RX10 Mark IV. Yes, it does have more points of phase detection on its hybrid autofocus system, but of course it also doesn't come with a built-in piece of Zeiss glass that pretty much covers the range of anything you could possibly want to shoot. So when it comes to comparing these two directly, the things that really stand out are very clear. I've mentioned them already. You're talking about autofocus speed, and then in addition to that, autofocus accuracy. Now, the RX10 Mark IV does also integrate some touchscreen functionality, but I don't find that to be a game changer in any way. The game changer is really about what's inside, the fact that we have 315 points of phase detection on that sensor, whereas in the Mark III we have nil. You just have phase detection, contrast, which is really, the most basic form of autofocus. It's not terrible, but it certainly is not in the same league, breadth, category, however you'd like to surmise that it's just not in the same realm. So even though these cameras look incredibly alike, in fact, they look like identical twins, it's what's on the inside that truly counts. Now, granted, we didn't get a bump up in megapixels, but you don't really need one. You have a 1-inch or really even sub 1-inch sensor if you want to get incredibly technical inside both of these cameras. So really, the only thing Sony had to improve was the autofocus quality, the potential, because ultimately when you have a bridge style camera like this, which is aimed directly at replacing an interchangeable lens camera system or giving someone with a hefty budget a high-end camera that wouldn't necessarily even consider an interchangeable lens camera, a camera that in theory can do it all, that's something where the Mark IV starts to become the epitome of that concept. So the RX10, in my opinion, up until the launch of the new Mark IV, was really a proof of concept that an incredible bridge camera could exist at an expensive price point. But whether or not it could actually cannibalize an interchangeable lens camera market, even the RX10 Mark III really couldn't necessarily, push aside something like the A6500. Granted, with any interchangeable lens camera system, you're going to be forking over a considerable amount of cash in order to get glass to give you the same performance you would get with something like either of these. But now that we have an autofocus system in the RX10 Mark IV that isn't as good but approaches the quality of an interchangeable lens camera, that's where things really start to get interesting. So in the past, many people asked me, could I give up an interchangeable lens camera system for something like the RX10 Mark III? My answer would have generally been, well, that really depends on your style of shooting and whether or not you require prime glass and how much you depend on autofocus. Because the RX10 Mark III was really much more of a hit or miss camera than the Mark IV for obvious reasons. We have not just a better autofocus system, but again, an autofocus system that generally is reserved for interchangeable lens cameras. So Sony did something, in my opinion, revolutionary here. It may not seem revolutionary because it's not like they developed new camera technology or, changed the game fundamentally. But what they did was revolutionary in that they stuck phase detection autofocus inside a bridge-style camera with an amazing piece of glass. So that wasn't done here with the Mark III, certainly wasn't done with the Mark I or II. The Mark III was all about giving us that extra focal range, taking that lens out to true telephoto class with the 600 millimeter reach. Now we have an autofocus system that can actually do that reach justice. And that was one of my biggest pet peeves with the RX10 Mark III. It fulfilled so many of my desires from a bridge-style camera of this caliber and cost. However, the autofocus system just wasn't there. Now with the Mark IV, we have exactly that. Now, does it leave some things to be desired? Of course it does. Of course it could be improved. And I imagine in the 5th generation, that's exactly what we'll see. We'll see that autofocus count go from 315 points to well over 400. Who knows, maybe it'll even hit 500, depending on how far Sony pushes its phase detection system in all of its other products. But one thing I can tell you is that when I shoot with the RX10 Mark IV and I go into burst mode and I'm, blowing out 24 shots like it's nothing, it reminds me of the Sony full-frame A9, which is a very high compliment to be paying a bridge-style camera. In fact, one that I thought I never would. In the same vein, the buffer is an issue. And that's where you can't necessarily compare the RX10 Mark IV to a full-frame A9 because the buffer is virtually, limitless compared to what we're having here inside the RX10 Mark IV. And that's when you're reminded that you are shooting with a bridge-style camera and really a hybrid, if you will, that tries to give you the best of both worlds without costing, putting you in the price range of professional gear. And for those of you who would, get a little bit of an immediate gut reflex reaction to say, well, but Ed, $1,700 is pro-style money. No, it's not pro-style money, but it is certainly enough to get you an interchangeable lens camera system that might suit your photographic needs more adequately than what the RX10 Mark IV is out there to do. The RX10 Mark IV is not meant for you prime shooters, portrait shooters. It can do all of those things, but that's not who Sony is targeting, just like every RX10 before it, including the Mark III right here to its right. So overall, to address the question that I started with at the top of this video, is the RX10 Mark IV worth the additional premium that it carries when compared to the RX10 Mark III? In my opinion, absolutely, every penny. And that is because if I could have had an RX10 Mark III with a superior autofocus system, I would have said to Sony, take my money. And that's exactly what they did here in the Mark IV. Now, I predicted, because it was obvious, not because I'm a genius, that the Mark IV would have this sort of functionality, and that was because the RX100 Mark V had it. So it'll be very interesting to see what the RX100 Mark VI has, but that's a compact camera. Neither of these are compact by any means, but they are compact when you start to introduce interchangeable lens systems where you would need gigantic lenses in order to achieve what this all-in-one wonder can in, again, one package that you could travel with exclusively on its own. Audio quality is great. Both of these cameras, of course, afford the ability to control the zoom speed. You have video profiles on here which have been omitted from cameras even like the A9, oddly enough. And that is, again, showing that Sony really wanted to hit a specific niche with both of these cameras. And now with the Mark IV sporting an autofocus system that I truly believe warrants the extra money, I think they've got a winner. All around so far, is this going to perform like a Sony A9? Absolutely not. Will it get close to performing like the Sony A6500? More than you'd think, even though it's missing the 5-axis image stabilization. So, and that brings me to what I think is coming next. You know, when you look at the evolution of the Mark III to the Mark IV, that we got improved overall image quality, because we did. I have seen them side by side. It's not a huge leap. It's marginal, but the autofocus is the key, as I mentioned. 10 more frames per second on burst shots, and then having actual accuracy that just doesn't exist in a contrast only world, whereas here we've got phase, so we have hybrid, so we have much more to work with on autofocus in terms of isolating your and tracking your actual subject. I believe the next version, the Mark V, logically would employ a 5-axis image stabilization. That would really be my wish. Again, I wish we would have had it here with the Mark IV, not to keep saying wish, 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 but that would have truly made the Mark IV a camera to beat, even when comparing it against interchangeable lens cameras from Sony. And I think that is something we will absolutely see. I could be wrong, but I'll make that prediction now. Don't be shocked if the Mark V just boosts up the number of phase detection points and offers 5-axis image stabilization, because even though we still have Sony's optical, intelligent optical image stabilization in both of these cameras, that's one area where I do not see an improvement. So when it comes to EVF, when it comes to handling, build quality, these cameras are identical. Again, the real core of the difference comes down to autofocus speed and autofocus preciseness, because you simply can't get the same sort of results, the number of keepers that you can from the Mark IV with the Mark III. So in my mind, if your budget permits, there is no question the Mark IV is the way to go, because after all, if you were interested or are interested in a bridge-style camera that's going to replace, a set of lenses, or you just want one camera to rule them all and you don't already own an exhaustive list of lenses, then the whole point of being able to really utilize and leverage this 24 to 600 millimeter piece of Carl Zeiss glass is having an autofocus system with the guts to actually back it up. Because after all, this was more of, in my opinion, a proof of concept. This is a practical realization and application of that concept. So the Mark IV takes a step that might seem incremental at face value, but in my opinion, it takes what was a good camera and makes it a camera that is actually worth every single penny, as I mentioned earlier. So they look a lot alike, but I can tell you the performance difference is real. Now, if you don't care about sports photography, birds in flight, subject tracking, then the Mark III is definitely something to consider at the lower price point. No question about it. I mean, given everything I've just told you, I keep saying autofocus, autofocus, autofocus. So if you don't care about the extra speed and accuracy that the Mark IV has to offer, save the money and go with the Mark III. However, again, in my mind, the whole premise of having a telephoto lens like this, fixed onto your camera, you want to have the best possible autofocus system, especially if you are trying to shoot things at the end or even middle of the range of this telephoto Zeiss piece of glass. And that's where the Mark IV achieves things that the Mark III could only dream about. And that pretty much sums it up. So again, in my opinion, the price gap is absolutely justified, because the Mark IV simply accomplishes things the Mark III could only aspire to and never could truly accomplish. When it comes to video performance, which I didn't touch on in this comparison, again, the same applies. I would say it's a wash, but with a better autofocus system, you're going to inherently get better results. And for those of you who are going to complain that I haven't actually shown you any of those results in this video, I would refer you to the video samples that I've already posted. Of course, I did those with the Mark III. I also did those with the Mark IV now. I have several video samples up, and will be providing more as I shoot more with the cameras. But again, these are two great cameras. They're both expensive. They're both aimed at different markets. You can see the finish appears to be slightly different on the screen with the Mark IV, and that's because it is a touch screen. Well, not a complete touch screen, but has the ability to touch to focus, which the Mark III did not. But overall, they're both cameras are great. You're not going to go wrong with either one. It's just that, again, you have to have expectations and realize that one camera may or may not meet them. The other one definitely will. And that's really where that price difference comes into play. So for me, it's an easy choice. Hopefully this has helped those of you that are wondering whether or not the Mark IV is worth the extra premium. In my opinion, there's really not a lot to talk about, even though I spent 20 minutes inside your ear. Any questions or comments, please feel free to post them. Hit that like button. And as usual, please feel free to subscribe. Later.